My son and his entitled wife moved into my dream retirement home, tricking me into signing papers that would give them everything. They treated me like a frail, confused old woman who wouldn't notice. For weeks, they smiled to my face while they cut me off from the world, planning to sell my home right from under me. The disrespect from my own family was suffocating. But they had no idea that their entire greedy scheme was about to crash into a perfect legal trap I had set years ago, and watching their faces when they realized it was so satisfying. For 40 years, I dreamed of the scent of salt and pine, and now finally it was mine. I'd sit on the sun-drenched porch of my little cottage on Hemlock Lane, watching the tide pull away from the rocky Maine shore. This was meant to be my sanctuary, the place I'd earned after a lifetime as a paralegal, a place for quiet and for peace. But you know how it is. Peace can be a hard thing to come by, even when you've paid for it. The screen door would creak open, and there she'd be. Danielle, my daughter-in-law, would sweep onto the porch with a glass of iced tea, telling me I shouldn't let myself get dehydrated. Her voice was always sharp and sugary, a combination that set my teeth on edge. She was a vision of country club perfection in her crisp linen dresses, but her smile was as bright and hard as a diamond. For the 3 weeks she, my son Ethan, and their 2 children had been here on this so-called extended visit, I'd felt less like the owner of the house and more like a fragile heirloom they had to manage. It started from the moment they arrived. The welcome dinner was a performance of loud, forced cheerfulness. Danielle bustled around my little cottage, complimenting the decor in a way that was really just a list of things she thought needed upgrading. I saw how her eyes darted everywhere, not admiring, but assessing, sizing up the property. I noticed the anxious way she'd glance at her phone every time it buzzed, the way her shoulders tensed. It wasn't the behavior of a woman on a relaxing vacation. It was the frantic energy of a cornered animal. In the days that followed, they built a gilded cage around me, piece by careful piece. The phone would ring, and before I could move, Danielle would snatch it up, chirping about how I should just rest and let her get it. My neighbor Carol, a lovely woman, stopped by with a blueberry pie one afternoon. Danielle met her at the door with a deeply concerned frown, explaining that I was terribly worn out and couldn't have visitors. She said they were all so worried about me being here all alone. They were painting my isolation as their protection. The betrayal, when it finally came, wasn't a dramatic confrontation. It was quiet, wrapped in the dull cloak of bureaucracy. Ethan sat next to Danielle at my kitchen table, looking pale and refusing to meet my eyes. He just fidgeted with a pen, while Danielle spread a fan of documents in front of me. She told me it was just some estate planning paperwork, that their financial advisor insisted it was crucial to get everything organized. It was all she said with that smooth as silk voice, just to make things easier for me, to protect me from scams. This one, she'd say, just gives us permission to talk to your bank, and that one is for the utilities. She slid a pen into my hand. I'd spent a lifetime reading fine print, every single line of every single contract. But I was tired, distracted by my grandson shouting in the yard, overwhelmed by the sheer volume of paper, and disarmed by my own son's silent, pleading look. I hesitated. Questioning them felt foolish, paranoid. So I signed where Danielle's perfectly manicured finger pointed. I found out later that a durable power of attorney was buried deep in that stack, its dense legal language disguised as a simple convenience. That night, after the house had fallen quiet, I was walking down the hall to get a glass of water. As I passed their slightly ajar bedroom door, I heard Danielle's voice. It wasn't her usual bright, sharp tone. It was a raw, panicked whisper that stopped me cold. She was furious, telling Ethan she didn't care what some man on the phone had said, that the market wasn't stabilizing. She said they were completely underwater and that the final call was coming in on the 15th. And then I heard the words that turned my blood to ice. She said, "My house, this house, was the only asset they could leverage. It was the only thing that could get them out. It had to be theirs." By the way, if you're enjoying the story so far, please consider subscribing so you don't miss what's next. We'd also love to hear your own story if you'd like to share it with our community. Now let's get back to it. I stood there in the dark hallway, for I don't know how long, with their whispered words echoing in my mind. Underwater. Deadline. It has to be ours. The shock felt like a physical blow, but as the minutes ticked by, that shock began to cool and harden into something else. Something solid and cold as ice. The hurt was still there, a deep, aching wound where my trust in my own son used to be. But the fear was gone. In its place, 40 years of legal training of reading the fine print and anticipating the moves of opponents began to stir from its retirement. The gentle, accommodating grandmother they thought they were dealing with had left the building. The paralegal was back on the clock. The next morning, I chose my moment with the precision of a surgeon. Danielle was on the porch, her back to the kitchen, her voice a low, tense murmur as she spoke into her phone. My son Ethan was at the counter making coffee, his shoulders slumped in a way that spoke of a man hollowed out by a weight he couldn't carry. I moved with a slow, deliberate calm that I didn't feel pouring myself a cup of tea. I asked Ethan about the new financial planner they'd hired for me. I pretended to struggle for the name, asking if it was a Mr. Thompson. I told him I couldn't quite recall signing on with him, and wondered if he could remind me of the firm's name just so I could look it up. "You would have thought I'd thrown a grenade into the kitchen." Ethan froze the coffee pot hovering in midair. The little color he had in his face drained away, leaving him looking pale and sick. He opened his mouth, but only a weak stammer came out as he tried to repeat the name. That's when Danielle appeared in the doorway. Her phone clutched in a white-knuckled grip. She asked if everything was all right, but her eyes were darting between me and her husband, trying to read the situation. I simply repeated my question, turning my calm gaze on her. Panic flared in her eyes for a split second before she masked it with a brittle smile. "Oh," she said, "it was Thompson and Associates, a wonderful exclusive firm. She told me they came highly recommended by the Wellingtons and that Ethan handled most of the correspondence. They were based in Boston," she added the words, rushing out of her in a torrent. I just raised an eyebrow. I said that was funny, because I was sure I'd heard Ethan mention their office was in Portland when we were signing those papers. The contradiction just hung there in the air between us, thick and undeniable. Ethan looked at Danielle with the wide, terrified eyes of a drowning man begging for a life raft. Her smile tightened, and I could see the cracks forming in her mask of control. She tried to brush it off, saying it was a big firm and that I must be misremembering. But the damage was done. Their frantic, fumbling attempt to patch together a lie told me everything I needed to know. They were amateurs. Desperate, sloppy amateurs. And that gave me an edge. That afternoon, I announced I was going to take a nap. In the quiet of my room, I pulled a hat box from the top of my closet. Tucked away inside was an old, unregistered burner phone my late husband had insisted we keep. At the time, I thought he was being paranoid, but now it felt like a gift from beyond the grave. I locked the door and dialed a number I knew by heart. When she answered, I told her it was me, Margot Ellison. I said I had a bit of a situation and that I needed a friend, but more than that, I needed a shark. I was calling Sarah, a woman I'd worked with for 20 years, a woman who could find a loophole in an ironclad contract. My first line of defense was now in place. It was as if they sensed my secret rebellion. That evening, I went to use the house phone to call my neighbor and found the line was dead. Danielle just shrugged when I mentioned it, saying the phone lines were so unreliable out here. The Wi-Fi was spotty too, she added. She said it was probably for the best that it would keep me safe from all those terrible scammers who prey on seniors. The gilded cage was now a fortress, and I understood then with perfect clarity that this wasn't just some misguided attempt to get a loan. This was a siege, and I was in far more danger than I had ever imagined. When you know the walls have ears, you have two choices. You can be silent, or you can give the walls the story they want to hear. I chose the second. My new role was the one they had written for me all along the frail, slightly confused matriarch. I began my performance the very next day. I started forgetting the names of my own grandchildren. I'd ask Danielle the same question about what was for dinner twice in an hour. I allowed a look of vague befuddlement to become my default expression, my eyes just a little unfocused. I started complaining of headaches and taking to my bed for long afternoon naps. And you know what? It worked perfectly. I could see the tension leaving their shoulders. My son Ethan started looking me in the eye again, his guilt replaced by a patronizing pity. Danielle's sharp, anxious energy softened into an arrogant, self-satisfied confidence. They thought their little panic in the kitchen was just a one-time scare, a bump in the road. They believed they had the situation and me completely under control. They saw my compliance as their victory. While they saw a woman in decline, my mind was sharper than it had been in years. And to understand what I was up against, you have to understand the sheer depth of their desperation. It wasn't something I knew then, but it was a truth festering at the heart of their lives. Just 3 months earlier, Danielle and Ethan were sitting in a sleek, glass-walled office in Boston, across from a man named Julian Croft. He was charismatic, impeccably dressed, and he spoke their language, the language of status and exclusivity. He told them about an off-market coastal development project, a chance to get in on the ground floor, with guaranteed 30% returns. He casually mentioned other investors from their social circle playing on their deepest fear, the fear of being left behind. Terrified of missing out, they liquidated everything. Their retirement accounts, the kids' college funds, all of it. They wired the money. And for 2 months, they lived in a fantasy of their impending wealth. Then the project's website vanished. Julian's number was disconnected. Their emails bounced. Finally, a single chilling message arrived from an anonymous address. It said to consider the transaction complete and that further contact was not advised. The shame was a physical weight, the secret of their ruin, a cancer eating them from the inside. My house wasn't just a house. It was their last desperate gamble to save themselves from the consequences of their own foolish pride. So while they saw me sleeping in my sunlit bedroom, I was a hive of clandestine activity. My afternoon naps were my office hours. I'd lock the door, pull the burner phone from its hiding place, and hold whispered conversations with Sarah. I gave her 2 missions. The first was to get a complete copy of the Hemlock Lane Trust from my secure deposit box at the bank. I had set that trust up years ago on the advice of a shrewd old lawyer. It was irrevocable, a legal fortress designed by experts to be untouchable. The property belonged to the trust, not to me, and I couldn't be forced to sell or leverage it. My second mission for Sarah was simply investigate a firm called Thompson and Associates. We both knew what she would find. Meanwhile, Danielle, drunk on her perceived success, grew careless. She started taking calls from real estate agents and contractors right in front of me. She'd discuss plans for a screened-in porch, talking about how it would add at least $50,000 to the valuation. She said it into her phone one afternoon, barely even glancing at me as I sat in my wicker chair, appearing to be lost in a daze. She told someone they needed to get an appraiser in here by the end of the month, and that the owner was, in her words, fully on board. She no longer saw me as a person. I had become a fixture of the property, a piece of antique furniture that came with the house. And that was her greatest mistake. She had forgotten that even the most delicate heirlooms can be made of unbending steel. I simply watched, listened, and documented every single word, my mind a flawless ledger recording the evidence of their mounting crimes. I had been playing the part of a wilting flower for days, and Danielle had finally stopped looking for thorns. She was so confident, so sure of her victory, that she'd started humming as she watered the hydrangeas on the porch. That's why she was so completely caught off guard when the sensible sedan crunched up my gravel driveway on Thursday morning. A woman in a sharply tailored business suit emerged carrying a leather briefcase. It was Sarah. And she looked less like a friendly visitor and more like an instrument of legal reckoning. Danielle immediately went on the defensive, trying to block the door and explaining that we weren't really accepting visitors. Sarah didn't even break her stride. She just stated in a voice that was polite but firm as granite that she was here to see her client Margot Ellison, and walked right past Danielle and into my cottage. I was waiting for her in the living room. Ethan, summoned by the noise, hovered nervously in the background. I greeted Sarah with a warmth and clarity that must have been a shock to them, all traces of the frail, confused woman I had been performing completely gone. Sarah didn't waste time with pleasantries. She opened her briefcase on the coffee table and got straight to the point. She said she had reviewed the documents I'd asked her to and had some concerns. Then she looked directly at Danielle. Her concerns, she said, were specifically regarding a durable power of attorney signed on August 12th. She also mentioned that she'd run a search for a financial advisory firm called Thompson & Associates, and strangely, no such firm was registered in Maine, Massachusetts, or any other New England state. The color drained from Danielle's face. She stammered that it was a private firm, that it was ridiculous. Sarah just held her gaze and countered her lie with a simple question, asking if it really was. Then she pulled out another document. She informed Danielle that it was a copy of the Hemlock Lane Trust, filed and executed 5 years ago. She explained as if to a child that this property was not owned by me, Margot Ellison. It was owned by the trust, an irrevocable trust. As such, she continued, I myself did not have the authority to make it collateral for a loan, nor could I grant that authority to anyone else via a power of attorney. The document they had me sign, Sarah concluded, was legally worthless. The silence that followed was so complete, I could hear the clock ticking on the mantelpiece. Ethan looked like he'd been physically punched in the stomach. Danielle just stared at the trust document, her entire carefully constructed world crumbling around her. She whispered that Sarah was lying, that it couldn't be true. Sarah calmly replied that the law doesn't lie. And then Danielle broke. It wasn't a dramatic shatter, but a slow, agonizing collapse. The dam of desperation she had been holding back for months, the one built with pride and fear, finally burst. She sank into a chair and sobbed, the words pouring out in a torrent of shame. She confessed everything. The money was all gone. They had lost everything, the college funds, their retirement savings, all of it. They were scammed. They were going to lose their house, their standing in the community. She wailed that she didn't know what else to do, that taking my house was the only way out. Her full, ugly confession hung in the air. Ethan stared at his wife, and I could see him truly understanding the depth of her deception for the first time. The secret they shared had been a bond, but her open confession was a chasm that opened between them. He accused her, his voice thick with betrayal. He said she told him it was just a temporary loan, that she told him I understood. He never knew she had faked an entire company. Their conspiracy fractured right there, blame shifting between them like sand. In that moment of chaos, the power in the room shifted irrevocably. I, who had been their silent victim, was now in complete command. I looked at my weeping daughter-in-law and my broken son, not with pity, but with the cold clarity of a judge. I told them that was enough, my voice cutting through the sobs. I stood up, no longer playing the part of a frail old woman, but embodying the full authority of the matriarch whose trust they had so profoundly violated. I announced that there would be a family meeting the next morning at 10 o'clock right here. Sarah would be present as my legal counsel. They would both be here, and they would listen. I left no room for argument. They were no longer guests in my home. They were defendants awaiting their sentence. The night before the final meeting was the quietest one yet. The usual tension was gone, replaced by the heavy, dead silence of defeat. When 10 o'clock in the morning arrived, my living room, once a place of forced family gatherings, felt exactly like a courtroom. Sarah and I sat on one side of the coffee table, a neat stack of documents placed squarely in the center. On the other side of the table sat my son Ethan and a hollowed-out version of Danielle. The confident, scheming woman from before was gone, replaced by a pale, trembling ghost who couldn't meet my eyes. The morning sun streamed through the windows, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the tense air, and I felt a profound sense of sorrow that it had come to this. But I knew sorrow was a luxury I couldn't afford. What was needed now was clarity. I began, my voice steady and devoid of all emotion. I didn't raise it. I didn't have to. The facts were my weapon. I started from the beginning, telling them that on August 3rd they had arrived for what they called an extended visit. For the next 9 days, they had systematically isolated me from my friends and neighbors. As I said it, I placed a printed log of the phone calls Danielle had intercepted on the table. Next, I recounted how on August 12th, they had presented me with a stack of documents under false pretenses, tricking me into signing a fraudulent power of attorney. I slid a copy of that document, with its fake letterhead, from a company that didn't exist next to the call log. Finally, I stated that they had then proceeded to contact real estate agents and appraisers, representing themselves as having legal control over a property that is and has always been protected by an irrevocable trust. I placed the thick-bound copy of the trust document on top of the pile. It landed with a soft, final thud. Systematically, piece by piece, document by document, I had dismantled every lie, exposing the full depth of their calculated deception. The true judgment, the public reckoning they so richly deserved, came not from me, but from Sarah. As I finished, she leaned forward, her expression one of cold professional gravity. She informed them that what they had done constituted a number of potential felonies. She listed them out, her voice clear and cutting financial exploitation of the elderly fraud forgery. She told them that these crimes carry significant prison sentences and hefty fines, and that the evidence I had collected was more than sufficient to ensure a conviction. The word prison hung in the air between us. This wasn't a family squabble anymore. This was a crime scene. I saw Ethan flinch as if he'd been physically struck. Danielle let out a small, strangled gasp. The condemnation from a legal professional and outsider representing the cold, hard reality of the world beyond our family drama was the true punishment. It stripped away any lingering shred of self-justification they might have had, leaving only the stark, ugly reality of their actions. Then it was my turn to deliver the verdict. It was not cruel, but it was absolute. I told them I had no interest in seeing my son go to jail. I looked at Ethan then, and I let him see the flicker of sorrow in my eyes for the son I thought I had raised. Then my gaze hardened as I turned to Danielle. I laid out the terms. The power of attorney was nullified effective immediately. They would pack their bags and vacate this property within 24 hours. They would sign a legally binding agreement, which Sarah had already drafted, relinquishing any and all future claims to this house or any part of my estate. They would never contest my will. I explained that if they agreed to these terms and were gone by noon the next day, I would not forward this file to the district attorney. I paused, letting the full weight of my mercy and its strict conditions sink in. I looked at them, two broken people who had tried to break me, and I felt nothing but a grim sense of finality. The illusion of family entitlement, of shared rights and blurred lines, had been shattered against the unbreakable wall of the law, and one woman's quiet, methodical resolve. I told them that this was not a negotiation. These were the consequences. They had built this reality. Now they would live in it. After the verdict was delivered, the house fell into a new kind of silence. It wasn't the tense, anxious silence of the weeks before, but the heavy, dead silence of a story that has reached its end. The 24 hours that followed were a blur of grim, methodical activity. There were no tears, no final arguments, just the quiet, frantic sounds of suitcases being packed and a car being loaded. The weight of what had happened, of the crimes they had committed, and the mercy they had been shown, seemed to have crushed any capacity for defiance. They moved like ghosts through my cottage, their social and financial ruin, now a palpable presence between them. Just before noon the next day, after signing the papers, Sarah had left for them with trembling hands. They were gone. I stood on my porch and watched their car disappear down the lane, not with a sense of triumph, but with the quiet, somber finality of a chapter closing for good. The air, for the first time in weeks, smelled only of pine and salt. 3 months later, the new reality had solidified. I learned through a few stilted phone calls that the fallout from their failed scheme and the original scam had forced them to sell their own home to cover their most pressing debts. The perfect social facade they had been willing to destroy me for was gone anyway, lost in a quiet implosion of their own making. From what I could gather, they were each walking a different path. Ethan, humbled and stripped of his arrogance, had taken a second job working nights and weekends. He was in his own quiet way, paying a penance for his weakness and complicity. Danielle's journey was more complicated. During one of our rare, brief calls, she admitted she had started seeing a therapist. Her voice was flat, devoid of its usual sharp confidence. She told me the therapist said she had to learn the difference between what she wanted and what she was owed. It was a simple sentence, but it held a universe of meaning. It wasn't an apology, not yet, but it was a start. For me, life on Hemlock Lane had finally become the sanctuary I had always intended it to be. The oppressive silence of my captivity was replaced by a gentle, peaceful quiet that I filled with my own choices. I reconnected with my neighbor Carol, and our regular afternoon teas on the porch became a cherished ritual of easy conversation and shared laughter. I started volunteering at the town library twice a week, my sharp paralegal's mind finding a new, more joyful purpose in organizing the town's historical archives. My home was no longer a fortress I had to defend. It was a haven I had successfully reclaimed. I wasn't lonely. I was independent. One crisp October evening, I was sitting on my porch, wrapped in a thick wool sweater, with a cup of hot tea warming my hands. The sun was sinking into the Atlantic, painting the sky in deep shades of orange and purple. My phone buzzed on the small table beside me. It was a text from Ethan. There were only 8 words. He just wanted to say he was sorry for everything. I read the words. There was no request, no justification, just a simple admission. I didn't reply immediately. Instead, I put the phone down, my gaze fixed on the last sliver of sun disappearing below the horizon. I took a slow, deep breath, inhaling the cool, salty air. The pain of their betrayal had been a heavy stone, but time and justice had worn it smooth. It was no longer a weapon against me, but a lesson I now carried. I had transformed that pain into the wisdom of boundaries. The consequences were real, the new dynamic was permanent, and the peace, finally, was all mine. In the end, Margot's story became a quiet but powerful lesson. It teaches that true strength isn't always found in loud confrontations, but in silent preparation and the calm authority of facts. Her family's desperate entitlement shattered against the unbreakable wall of her competence and foresight. She showed them that kindness is not a weakness to be exploited, and that true independence is a fortress built with wisdom. Her victory wasn't just about reclaiming a house, but about proving that the greatest power is often the quiet, methodical resolve that the arrogant and greedy will always underestimate.